We're going to look, a little bit deeper at the Sermon on the Mount and that passage that Ed read. So first I'm going to say a couple meta words about the Sermon on the Mount and then hopefully dive into our little slice of it. Starting with a little story. So in January of this year, Jerry Falwell Jr., fundamentalist leader in the U.S., was interviewed by the Washington Post, and he was talking about Trump and Jesus and politics. And at one point in his interview, and a few people picked this up, he actually referenced children being detained on the southern U.S. border in apparent contrast with the words of Jesus that say, "Suffer the little children unto me." And he argued essentially that the ethics presented by Jesus, especially in the Sermon on the Mount, are not meant to inform how we run government or do public policy, but are more for private faith. I heard laughter. So that's interesting, and maybe that surprises you, and maybe that doesn't surprise you. But this isn't a new idea, especially when it comes to these words of Jesus, which are so intense in the Sermon on the Mount. So the Sermon on the Mount is what we've been deep diving into this Lent, and it's basically the clearest, fullest picture, the longest set piece of Jesus' teaching in the entire New Testament from Matthew 5 to 7, and it's kind of like Jesus' greatest hits. If you're familiar with some of the stuff that Jesus likes to talk about, you know some of these hits, like the Lord's Prayer, like build your house on a rock, not on the sandy land, like don't worry, but trust in the Father who provides for the lilies of the field. Turn the other cheek, love your enemy, go the extra mile, pray for those who persecute you, right? Those are the hits. But those and more, the Sermon on the Mount is actually quite intense because loving enemies is nice when I say it here, but actually loving and doing the work to love our literal enemies is not easy. Or how about things like when Jesus says, if you hate or lust, look at somebody with hate or lust, even if you don't act on it, you're guilty of murder and adultery. That's kind of intense, and that's a little intimidating. And if you read these words as actually a measure of what it looks like to be, let's say, a good Christian, you might be tempted to just give up before starting, because who could possibly live that way? And you'd kind of be right in a sense, because who can live that way? But rather than accept that, that's a real tension for us as individuals, but it's also a real tension. Why is it that our churches don't look more like what Jesus is presenting in the Sermon on the Mount? Instead of accepting and living in that tension, or seeing Jesus' words as an invitation rather than a threat, oftentimes the church has done what we sometimes do best, which is a little bit of theological gymnastics that allow us to avoid being confronted with this disrupting vision of what life ought to look like in Christ and kind of make it something else. So I don't know if that's been your experience or if you've heard some of these things, kind of these deflections of what Jesus is actually saying in the Sermon on the Mount. So maybe you've heard something like, in this piece and in many of Jesus' teachings, Jesus was speaking to just his disciples in giving them an ethic for them to live out. Or, this was just for this time and place. Or this is one that I kind of heard a lot, which is, this is just Jesus talking about being perfect to illustrate to all of us just how far we fall short. Christ led this life that we can't do this stuff. And there's something to that, but not so much to that we can be content to just kind of leave it behind and go the other way. So I know that I've taken personal comfort and reminded people several times that the Sermon on the Mount actually begins with this statement, like the very first words are, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." And for me, I take comfort in, maybe that means at least, blessed are those who know they have no chance of living this stuff out. But now let's go and do our level best by the power of the Spirit in us to do that. So falling short, needing grace, notwithstanding, those are definitely true things, but maybe, just maybe, Jesus actually wanted us to love our enemies. Or like theologian Dallas Willard, he has a great YouTube lectures just looking at the Sermon on the Mount and just kind of asking the obvious questions like, what if Jesus actually meant for us to do this? What if Jesus actually wants us to pray for those who persecute us? Like, do you pray for those who persecute you? What if Jesus actually wants us to not call our brother and sister, not just in our own family, but in the larger sense? What if he doesn't want us for real to call them a fool? What if he actually wants us to control our anger and lust and greed and back off judging other people? Now, of course, Jesus wants us to take his words seriously, but it's interesting how sometimes, routinely, the church has found ways to dodge taking Jesus seriously in the Sermon on the Mount. And this is just my meta theory that I'm thinking about, so take it or leave it. But I think it might have something to do with the Protestant Reformation, where there was this shift, which was a good and necessary shift, where rightly we recovered a theology of salvation by grace alone, right? God invites all sinners, however you've lived your life, however contrary to the Sermon on the Mount you might be. Nevertheless, God in Christ welcomes us to himself. And that's good news. So that kind of led us to a certain emphasis, right? So that leads us to an emphasis, especially with Paul and New Testament writers, who give us a theological framework of how, in the death and resurrection of Christ, we're reconciled to God. Good stuff, necessary stuff, but a side effect is that if we, and we talked about this a few weeks ago too, if we truncate the narrative to be just that Jesus came to die and rise again so that after we die, we can go to be with him. If we just take that emphasis, then it makes a lot more sense that we would listen mostly to the post-resurrection teaching and ethics of Paul, but we'd be a little bit more puzzled about what to do with the pre-death and resurrection, the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. So maybe in that shift, we might start to look at Jesus of Nazareth and his healing the sick and everything else and be like, oh, okay, we get it. That reveals something about God's character and Jesus' character. But what about those things that he says about radical discipleship and the cost of following him? Well, maybe we can emphasize that stuff a little bit less. Anyway, that might or might not be part of why sometimes in Christian circles we keep the Sermon on the Mount on a leash, or it might just be because it's just plain radical and difficult. I don't know. But in any case, there has been in Western Christianity a bit of an avoidance and lots of moves, maybe you haven't experienced it or don't know what I'm talking about, that to avoid actually taking the Sermon on the Mount seriously. So much so that Gandhi, you've heard of Gandhi, he was kind of a big deal. So Gandhi, when he was in England, said based on the Sermon on the Mount, he would consider himself a Christian. And he read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' words, Matthew 5-7, every single day. And yet Gandhi was criticized by UK Christians for taking the Sermon on the Mount too literally. So he, a Hindu, responded to his Christian critics by saying this: well, I do not believe this. I think the Sermon on the Mount has no meaning if it is not of vital use in everyday life to everyone. Nor do I accept the limitations that are sought to be put upon the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount. The teaching of the sermon was meant for each and every one of us. So hopefully, for us as Christians, which literally is defined as followers, disciples, students of Jesus, we agree and take the words of Jesus at least as seriously as this Hindu dude, right? Okay, so enough meta stuff. Now let's go down to that slice of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6. The words of Jesus, and Ed read them already, so I'm going to read them a little fast. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And it's interesting, in either way, he assumes that we are giving and acting generously. But as we've already seen and we'll continue to see in a minute, Jesus is basically introducing a theme here. And I think in some ways, it's sort of obvious. It might not be easy, but the lesson is obvious and something we've heard before. For example, my wife Sherry and son Jonah right now are on a mission trip with their school, with Calgary Christian School, off to Belize. And it's me and Jamie, my daughter, who are at home. And Jamie is a reasonable, responsible, clean human being. I am not. So when Sherry's away, the overall appearance inside and out of our house, counters, clothes on the floor, these things change a little bit, right? They go into a state of disarray. If we move between chaos and order, I'm definitely on the chaos side. So things are different. But on March 30th, I'm going to pick up Sherry and Jonah from the airport, and I guarantee that when we come back home and she comes into the house will be spotless and beautiful and clean. And I will work to make that happen for no other reason than to make Sherry happy, but even more to make Sherry happy with me. So 0% of my cleaning will be about treasures in heaven. It'll all be about my earthly reward. And in fact, but as I was reflecting on that this week, it's even more twisted because somehow I struggle with having let her know that if I let her know how bad the house got, then she'll think I'm a bad person, but then she'll at least know that I worked really hard to make the house great. So I don't know how to work on that. Okay, so I definitely have issues, but I hope on some level, maybe not as extreme, we can all relate to that. Or how about the example of a coffee house? If you've ever been in a coffee house and you want to leave the barista a tip, you don't want to leave the barista a tip while they have their back turned, right? That's the worst. You go to leave the tip and they turn their back. And this is kind of brilliantly, if you're Seinfeld fans, this was brilliantly Google Seinfeld's George tip jar. It's basically where George is at the counter and he's trying to make this server like him. And so he goes to put this big bill, this generous tip in the jar, but right at that moment, the server turns his head and he's like, oh man, this is a big tip. So then when the server's turned his back, he's like, okay, he's gonna fix this. So he reaches into the tip jar to pull it out so he can be seen. But that's, of course, when the server looks at him and then he gets kicked out and banned out of the restaurant for life. Anyway, I think that's a Jesus-style parable. It has like the perfect reversal at the end. But I could give 1,000 examples. We all know that on so many levels, we want to act for the praise of others. That's not a shocker. So going on, and when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father, who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, don't keep babbling like the pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Don't be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. One of the things to note in this passage is, of course, it's in a religious culture. So in first century Galilee, the most important part about who you were is your religious self, your religious identity, but you would never talk about your religious identity because it's so much the air you breathe. Your religious identity is just assumed unless you're a pagan or apostate, right? So the most powerful people running around in first century Galilee would have been the Romans, and they are seen as kind of the pagan oppressor. But other than that, the most important people are the holy people, mostly men, the revered ones, the religious scholars, the temple authorities, and all of this, because they're the people who are close to God and should be listened to. And I'm saying this because I can't really imagine in 2019 Calgary too many contexts in which you'd be tempted to pray a super long prayer to impress everybody and raise your social status. It doesn't even work in church, for goodness sakes. You're like, come on already. So it's a different context. Okay, now I'm going to skip a few verses that we'll come back to, but to verse 16. And when you fast, don't look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces, trying to show others they're fasting. Truly, I tell you, they've received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Again, you might get cred in some circles if you try to highlight how you're suffering, for your Lenten fast. But we do live in a culture where if your religious practice is making you suffer that much, probably someone would say, well, don't do it then. You don't have to. In other words, the examples that Jesus gives might not be easy to relate to necessarily, but we can certainly relate to acting in a way that gets praise and recognition, as opposed to wondering about our interior life that develops and is seen and unfolds in the presence of God. So a couple weeks ago, we talked about the fourth wall, and the idea, and I find that I'm coming back to themes in sermons lately, in the Sermon on the Mount, because I'm wondering and I'm struggling and trying to wrestle through this stuff. Anyway, so we talked a few weeks ago about how our lives are in many ways very performative. We're social animals, where fitting in and having people like us is important to us. It's a part of our DNA. And we adjust who we are according, in many ways, to where we find ourselves. So when you go to work, you kind of put on your work identity hat, and you have your church hat. And when you come to church, you sort of play along with the accepted social norms and everything else in that theater. And that's not a terrible thing that we wear different hats, right? Like, I don't want Jonah to talk to his grandma in the same way that he talks to his friends, right? It's appropriate. Wear a different hat. Please wear a different hat. But we also know that in the world of screens and social media and documenting our own lives and watching the lives of others and measuring ourselves, even though we say we're more sophisticated than that measuring ourselves in terms of likes or impressions, and having phones that never shut off, it can be hard to find a place away from the gaze of those who we'd perform for, to just be alone in the presence of God. So maybe the extreme version of that is reality TV, like a show like Big Brother or Survivor or The Bachelor or something like that, where the cameras are actually on all the time and people are pretending like the cameras are not on, but you know that they are on, and they sort of become characters of themselves and sort of do whatever to create drama or outrage or whatever it happens to be. And I wonder if part of the draw to those shows is in some ways that it's kind of a mirror reflecting back that too much of our lives are performative, are under the pressure to perform. And it can be a struggle to know, well, but who am I really? I see myself in all these different contexts with all these hats, but who am I really? And I kind of operate under the base assumption, or that none of us really know who we are. We don't. We're deep mysteries. Our ego and our constructed identities are always calling for our performance. Do what you need to get along, to fit in, to get ahead, to be liked, to be seen as a good person. But we're always conscious that there's these cameras, whether they're real or perceived, in our lives. And maybe it's the social pressure that we feel. Maybe it's the voices in our own head, the ones that sometimes praise us but often scold us. The gap between who we think we ought to be and who we experience ourselves actually to be. We ask that question, but who am I? Who am I really? And I think that in this passage, one of the things that Jesus might be doing is inviting us to a space where the cameras shut off, basically, and we find ourselves in God's presence, his beloved, for no other reason than his good grace. And in that place, we can actually start to become who we really are, who we're being recreated to be. So there's two ways of looking at the passage that we looked at. And again, you could see it in the sense that Jesus is just asking his followers to swap one audience for another. Okay, so forget about trying to please the people around you and getting the reward right now, and instead do what you're going to do for a different audience, which is God, and then you're going to get your reward in the future after you die. And the next lines talk about not storing treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, but store treasures in heaven. So one reading is this. Yes, please people to get your ego stroked, or please God, and you get bonus life in heaven. I'm not sure what that looks like. Maybe extra days snowboarding. I have a different vision of heaven. Okay, fine. But again, I remind us to keep in balance this 21st century Christian idea that we have, that sometimes we make it impossible to hear anything Jesus has to say because we're so focused on the narrative that it's after, that heaven has to do with what's after we die, instead of that Jesus is calling us to live in our lives right now. So here's the second reading, and you don't have to agree with this, but it's a good imagination experiment anyway. So imagine that Jesus says, before we hear this passage, that Jesus says this to you and to me. Listen, 21st century Canadian, life after death, don't worry about it. My grace is sufficient. I've got you. But now, right now, what I'm going to tell you has absolutely nothing to do with after you die, 0%. I'm talking about life right now. So if that was the preface to reading this passage, then how do we hear the words, store up your treasure in heaven and not on earth? And then what does it mean when Jesus says, don't do good things for the sake of others to receive their praise. Do good in the presence of your Father in heaven, and he will reward you. Not to swap, again, performing for the sake of people instead of performing for the sake of God. God doesn't need our performance. God doesn't need our best. He's not waiting for us to complete him by the good works that we do. But what if instead his very goodness, his love, that peace that passes understanding, the long-suffering, gentleness, kindness, steadfast faithfulness, patience, self-control, generosity, what if in his presence these can be not just costumes that we put on to impress people, but these can actually be the characteristics that God is transforming us to take on ourselves, to be ourselves like Christ, more fully alive and made in his image. If that's getting too spiritual, ethereal, practical example, again back to Dallas Willard, who I like. Because the Sermon on the Mount became such a big text for him, he became a real champion of spiritual disciplines like prayer or fasting or maybe singing. I loved those, if we could spend time just singing those 3 songs we opened with. Fasting, meditation, jogging. No, I don't know how that got in there. Not that one. Maybe, but my paraphrase of Dallas Willard is this. I take on spiritual disciplines to force myself to do something I don't want to do, on the one hand, to get the benefit of doing that thing, but in a deeper sense, I want to be shaped into the kind of person that would do that thing anyway, without having to be forced by a discipline. So if you take the example of jogging, sure, you force yourself to jog, and maybe you force yourself to do that by journaling, or you get an accountability partner or something else because you want to get healthy, whatever. But the best moment is when you no longer need that accountability partner because you're actually being transformed. So instead of having to convince yourself to get out and go jogging, it would be harder to convince you not to go jogging because that's who you now are and something that you want to do. I love that picture. And I kind of feel like that's something that's going on in this passage. It's an invitation to get out of the performative way and mode of being, out of trying to please people, out of trying to please our projection of God, who we think needs, who we sometimes imagine needs our performance, away from the anxiety we might feel about heaven and hell, and ushering us into that eternal present, where eternal love is present, transforming us to become new creations in Christ. So again, going through this, I'm going through this because I'm preaching to myself. This is my problem that I need to hear. With my work, my main job, Resonate, which is our denomination's mission agency, we did these profile tests, and we did the Berkman tests, and then you get together as a team and you're like, how are you wired as a person? One of the things that I was confronted with is there's this one scale when we're going through the results together, and everyone was on, there's this one scale where on the one hand is like, I would do anything to make, my company and team succeed. And the other side is like, I would do anything to make myself succeed. And like everybody on the team is on the, I would do it for the team. I'm on the, I would do it for myself. And so my response to the professional who's doing this work is like, I'm not a monster. I care about people. I want everybody to succeed. I want to Resonate to do a good job and everything else. And she said, yeah, well, it's more to do with how you're wired, in that more than you care about the company, and this came through in my other results, right, is I don't want to be the one to screw it up. So what I care about most is, sure, I want the company to do well, I want everybody to do well, but I don't want to be the one to drop the ball. I don't want to be the one to mess it up. And going through that test, I start to see in myself this desire to please people. That's part of my nature. I want to please people because I want to be thought of well. I want people to like me. I want people at work to like me. I want my kids and family to like me. I want all you to like me. It's a driver in that place. But then it's also a question of, yeah, but who am I? Who is it that God sees me as? And can I accept his love that's just his love for grace and live out of that instead of trying to earn it by not dropping the ball or by doing so awesome here, there, and everywhere? How do we get ourselves into that place that I need to be in, that place that I'm sure many of us need to be in? Because Jesus actually intends for us to do something, right? To respond to that call. Well, and I'll close with a couple practical things. So while we can do those spiritual disciplines, like prayer, like meditation, like being mindful, maybe jogging, maybe reading, maybe talking with some trusted friends who we can do mutual growth with, maybe doing some counseling to attend to the mystery that is you, and discovering all the ways that you can let go of the pressure of performing to those around you. Maybe we can be like Gandhi, and if reading the Sermon on the Mount is too much every day, how about every week? Like Monday morning, or how about the first of the month or something like that? Maybe it's doing an experiment, like doing an inventory of some of the places where you find yourself, and maybe where you feel pressured to be someone you're not, and ask if maybe it's okay that you let go of that, and if God is calling you to something different. And there's one other thing that you can do, and this is what we're going to close with. And you can do this anytime and any place. And it's actually the verses that Ed read and the verses that I skipped earlier. Right after Jesus said, don't pray to show off, pray in secret where your Father sees you. Then he says, you know what? I'm going to get real specific and tell you how to do this. And this is verse 9. It says, "This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven." And two quick notes before we're going to close with that, really. But two quick notes first. One is religious people, speaking of the first century, religious people in Jesus' day did not typically talk about Yahweh, God, as Father. That was seen as scandalously intimate, that Jesus refers to God as Abba, Father. It's a very intimate term for God. And what's beautiful about this prayer is not only does Jesus address God in this beautiful, intimate way, but he invites us to be in that same intimacy of Jesus' relationship with his Father is also the relationship that he invites us into. And then the last little note I'm going to make is, you might have noticed that in Matthew and Luke, that little phrase of, "For thine is the glory, the kingdom, the power forever and ever," they don't have that. That was actually added later, and the first part is in the Didache. See how all these sermons keep coming back again? So the Didache in about 90 AD is where it came, but I think it's appropriate to end with that. Okay, so in this place, and hear this today as our prayer collectively, but also hear this as an invitation from Jesus himself, something that we can pray anytime, any place, when we need to get out of that performative space and into that space where we know that we are God's beloved. Our Father in heaven, holy is your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we have also forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Amen.